Good morning. I hope that this message finds you keeping well and safe. We continue today on our journey through this letter that Paul wrote to the church in Galatia. And we've got up to the very end of chapter 5, and we'll be looking at that last verse of chapter 5 and the first 10 verses of chapter 6. So let's hear them, shall we, this morning? Let us not become conceited, provoking and envying each other. Brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who are spiritual should restore them gently. But watch yourself, or you may also be tempted. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. If anyone thinks that they are something when they are nothing, they deceive themselves. Each one should test their own actions, and then they can take pride in themselves without comparing themselves to somebody else, for each one should carry their own load. Anyone who receives instruction in the word must share all good things with his instructor. Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A person reaps what he sows. The one who sows to please their sinful nature, from that nature will also reap destruction. But the one who sows to please the Spirit, from the Spirit will reap eternal life. Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers. And the second reading is just a few verses from the letter to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Some well-known verses that speak of the nature of love. And now I will show you the most excellent way. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have faith that can move mountains, but I have not love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and surrender my body to the flames, but have not love, I gain nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It is not rude. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, and always perseveres. Love never fails. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. As a Norwich City supporter, I have to say that the football is not offering me any joy at the moment at all. I'm quite sure that our fantasy football team that's set up in the league at Broadway Baptist is probably faring much better, but there's nothing new there. I've often wondered whether fantasy football teams would ever really do as well in reality as they do on paper, because they're usually made up of star players from different teams, and I wonder whether any more than one star player in a team could just become a nightmare. After all, winning matches doesn't just rest upon one player, does it? It rests upon being able to play and work as a team, with every player working for the good of the team, not just for themselves. I also wonder whether there could ever be a pitch that was big enough to house all of the egos of the fantasy football team. And I wonder whether the crisis into which Paul is speaking in Galatia had left the church there a little bit like a fantasy football team. A church full of people who saw themselves as being a particular type or class of Christian and looked down on all the others who weren't quite the same calibre as them. I mean, there would have been Jewish Christians, Gentile Christians, Roman citizens, wealthy, poor, slave or free, male and female. Paul's made a big deal about emphasising that living out the gospel means that these identities are no longer of any importance. We're all equally children of God, he keeps saying, and that is that. And our world continues to tear itself apart by highlighting, isn't it, all the differences that there can be between us as human beings. People today are abused and mistreated. They're persecuted and face injustice simply because of race and colour, sexuality and gender. And please don't think that these things don't also happen within the church, because they do. So how important it is that we as Jesus followers reflect the truth of what the gospel makes us, all of us, children of God and also family. And this is how we are to behave and treat one another. We are called to be a first-rate team, not a fantasy football team, fighting to find space for all the egos. Our relationship should be influenced and marked by the transforming power and truth of the gospel of Jesus. Paul challenges us, I think, here to ask what difference the gospel actually makes to our relationships. But maybe another question that he poses here is how the gospel affects the way you look at yourself in terms of those around you, and how you look at others in terms of yourself. You see, the gospel offers all who accept it a brand new self-image, and this is not based on comparisons with others at all, because only the gospel makes us neither full of self-confidence nor self-loathing, both bold and humble. Humble because before anyone we are told we are sinners saved only by God's grace. And bold because before anyone we are told we are loved and honoured by the only eyes in the universe that really count, the King of Kings. Surely the enormity of that truth has got to work itself out in our relationships with everyone around us. It means that rather than comparing ourselves with those we consider to be above us or below us, we look only at our responsibility to take what we are and what we have and offer that to God as a sacrifice of thanks. So how might we go about allowing this gospel truth to work itself out in our relationships? There's three things that struck me as I thought about this week. The first one is, I think that Paul says it quite clearly in that last verse of chapter 5. Don't become conceited. We've got to deal with our conceit. Now, conceit is all about a vanity and pride that's gained through a comparison of who we are against someone else. And at the end of the day, I think it's a deep insecurity that can result in us having to need to prove our worth, not only to ourselves, but also to others. And it seems here to me that Paul considers that this can happen in two ways. I do think it's worth just taking a moment to identify them. He talks about not being conceited as provoking or envying one another. And both of these are two different ways of relating to others. Provoking being the position of someone very sure of their superiority, looking down on someone seen as being weaker or less superior. Envy being the position of someone looking up at someone they feel is above them in some way. And what Paul highlights here is that both superiority and inferiority are a form of conceit, because both result in a person being completely self-absorbed, focused heavily on how others see them or make them feel. And Paul is here saying, do not let your hunger for honour or your hunger for recognition and acceptance make you either despise people or envy them. And if we're being honest with ourselves, I think we'll know that we can be a mixture of this superiority and inferiority at times. It's something we ought to consider prayerfully, I think, so that we can identify these emotions and these feelings and these responses that happen within us. Maybe by asking these questions it could help. I know it's helped me. Do I have a tendency to blow up or clam up? Do I tend to pick arguments with people? Or do I just completely avoid any confrontation? Do I tend to get very down on individuals or groups? Or am I more embarrassed and intimidated around certain kinds of people? When criticised, do I get very angry, judgmental and attack right back? Or do I just get discouraged, defensive, make excuses and just give in? But do I often think, I would never ever do what that person has done? Or do I look at people and think, I could never ever accomplish what that person has? You see, the answers to these questions, I think, highlight areas and situations where we might need to preach the gospel to ourselves. If we're finding ourselves a bit defensive around someone, then let's hear the gospel truth that what this person thinks of us isn't really the important thing. It's only the approval of Jesus and no one else that makes us right with God and gives us our identity and worth. And if we find ourselves looking down on someone, then equally we need to hear the gospel truth that what we think of ourselves is not the important thing, because we are equally as undeserving of the love of God as this person is, and they are loved no more or less by God than we are. You know, when we fail to take this seriously, when we fail to apply these truths to our emotions, and when we fail to root our worth and our identity in who we are in and through Jesus, I think we make it very difficult for ourselves to live as brothers and sisters in Christ. So living out gospel relationships requires each of us to deal with our conceit. But I think Paul seems to mention that we are to carry each other's burdens as well. And it involves this, carrying each other's burdens. I think this fleshes out what Paul's already spoken about in chapter 5, where he says that you should use your freedom to serve one another in love. And he talks about loving your neighbour as yourself, which sums up the whole law. Serving one another in love means carrying each other's burdens, and Paul says this fulfills the law. And it also does something else. It brings this lofty concept of love down to earth. Don't let others carry their burdens alone. And burdens can be simple responsibilities, I think, everyday things, helping out with shopping and decorating, bringing up the kids. But they can be struggles also and questions with faith and belief. All of the things that we might struggle with at times with our relationships with God. Or they can be crisis moments and specific difficulties and problems. But by speaking about the responsibility to carry each other's burdens, I think Paul practically shows us how we should relate to others. You can't help with a burden unless you come close to the burdened person, unless you're almost standing in their shoes and putting your own strength under the burden so its weight is distributed on the both of you. Carrying another's burden is an act of love that is marked by all that we heard in our Corinthians reading. It's marked by patience and kindness, humility, selflessness, perseverance. It's messy. And it's costly, and it will break your heart, and it will challenge your faith, and it will disturb your comfort and peace, and it will take you to places you might not want to go, but it will reflect Jesus and all the ways he's carried your burdens. So I wonder how many of you have ever really carried another's burdens like this. Deal with your conceit, says Paul. Carry each other's burdens. But finally, he also goes on to talk about making sure that we carry our own load. Notice that this carrying your own load of verse 5 comes after another warning about being conceited. And let's be clear here that burdens and loads are not the same thing. And I know this because I looked about it in the commentary. I looked it up. Greek words here that are used for burden and loads are used to refer to different things. A burden is a heavy weight, but a load refers to a kind of a backpack. So it seems that each of us has different sets of difficulties and opportunities and weaknesses and gifts, and these are our loads, our responsibilities before God. Carrying our own loads can actually help us, if you think about it, to not become conceited, because the reality is we can't compare ourselves to one another because we're different. And we have different loads, and we must look at our particular tests and duties and respond to them obediently. And if we do this, then we start judging our lives each day against who we have been and who we could have been. And marking progress this way offers us encouragement that doesn't depend on comparison with someone else. It's not about whether I'm better or worse than others around me, but whether I'm making progress in living obediently with the load that I am given. God has allowed and given each one of us different loads to carry and to serve him with. And your task is to carry your load in a way that pleases God. And seeing life this way should also make us slower to judge others and more generous as well. After all, do you know the exact details of the load that everyone else has to carry? Possibly not. But if you did, you may know that one thing that could grant insight into why they are the way they are. Allowing the gospel to fully influence our relationships results in us becoming, I think, a brilliant team that needs everyone to be included and needs everyone to be involved in equal measure. The alternative is like a fantasy football team. It's an arrangement where we tear one another apart while scrapping for space for our agendas and our egos. The gospel in all its uniqueness, in all of its glory and its power, is life-changing. And according to Paul, it should affect all of our relationships. How does it affect yours? Deal with your conceit, carry one another's burdens, and carry your own load, so that you can take advantage of every opportunity to be a blessing to others, especially to your brothers and sisters in the family of faith.